Despite a few technical issues, I'm kind of here on time. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here in the reading room, is where we all are. I know billions, maybe even trillions. October 21st is today, and it is day 261. Thank you so much for joining me. And let's get going. I was like, where is the book? No way. Where's the book? I know I did a little 2 minutes. So there's a 2-minute short on the book, an excerpt from the book. I think only one. I'm like, I can't find the book. Oh, what? What up with not being able to find the book? And it is in my handy dandy messenger bag, which, by the way, now has its handy dandy little strap. I know, not everything you expected to hear in the reading room, but maybe enlightenment is in your future. All right, so we've got the book. And we're ready to get started. 60 people who shaped the church, learning from sinners, saints, rogues, and heroes. Chapter 15, 16, and 17. We're going to read about Augustine of Hippo, from delinquent to theologian. We are going to read today about, and remember, these are in chronological order, Pope Leo the First, the Pope who roared. That's roared. Circa 400 to 461, with Augustine 354 to 430. And after Pope Leo, the Venerable Bede, changing the world with his pen, circa 673 to 735. Always great to hear from the past, especially for our bookless classroom. All right, let's get going. Augustine of Hippo, from delinquent to theologian, 354 to 430. Instantly, as I reached the end of the sentence, it was as if the light of peace was poured into my heart, and all the shades of doubt faded away. Augustine, Confessions. You know, if that is not, again, as I said, and for the shorts, what I was reading was from Athanasius. So, and what I was saying was that how you could feel truth. I mean, how you literally feel it. God would not only have you know truth, it would move you. It would move you. Real truth down deep would move you. Instantly, as I reached the end of the sentence, it was as if the light of peace was poured into my heart, and all the shades of doubt faded away. Augustine, Confessions. An elderly man lay upon his deathbed. From beneath the covers, he could see selections from the book of Psalms affixed to his walls. In the last 10 days of his life, he pondered these words and his existence. The frail figure of Augustine teetered on the edge of the grave, awaiting the transfer from the pains of the earthly world to the joys of the heavenly kingdom. All around him was trouble. The city he loved was under siege. And shortly after his death, the city would fall, and the attackers would find that most of the city's inhabitants were dead or dying of starvation. Aurelius Augustinus, or Augustine, lived a life that forever changed the church. He is one of the few theologians and ministers revered by both Protestants and Catholics. This is, I think, who my Uncle Gus was named after. Augustine was an intellectual giant. Historians and theologians hold him in high regard, yet those who knew him when he was a young man could never have guessed how the troublemaker would change. Early in his life, he was a poor student and found more pleasure in causing trouble than in learning. Born to a minor Roman official father and Monica, a devout Christian mother, Augustine preferred thrills and pleasure over education. He and his friends would steal pears from a neighbor's from a neighbor's orchard, not because they were hungry, but because they enjoyed the thrill of it. In most cases, they fed the stolen goods to pigs. His poor work ethic in school brought reprimands and even beatings, but Augustine didn't care. He was a rebel, a delinquent, a young man addicted to fun and pleasure. Then came an opportunity to study at Carthage. Carthage was a much larger city than Augustine's small community of Tagaste, and he was ready to leave behind small-town life for the city lights. Once out of his Christian mother's reach and care, Augustine did what many young people do when initially freed from the restrictions of home life. He partied. While still in his teen years, Augustine took a lover and became a father. Marrying the woman was out of the question, as this would damage his future career. While he was indulging his passions, Augustine also developed a love for philosophy and rhetoric. His past actions troubled him, and now on his own, free to do whatever he chose, he began to reflect on his life choices. Perhaps he was growing up, or perhaps having a child of his own sobered him. Regardless, he set aside some of the frivolity that had consumed him. His intellect grew hungry. Where once he had to be punished and beaten to learn, he now did so because of his growing love of knowledge. The fervent prayers of his mother were also certainly a factor in the changes taking place in Augustine's life. She prayed for him constantly, and her greatest desire was to see him commit to Christ. Yet Augustine was not a converted man. He wanted nothing to do with his mother's faith. To him, Christianity was the religion of the uneducated and simple-minded. But despite Augustine's resolute pursuit of his education and apparent disdain of his mother's faith, he was profoundly unhappy. He had freedom. He had a mistress. He had his learning, and he was gaining a following of students. Still, he was unhappy. Worse, he was miserable and had no idea how to fix himself. It was a struggle he'd endured for years, even as he maintained a successful vocation as a teacher in Carthage, then Rome, and then Milan. Unhappiness, although unpleasant, can lead to something beneficial. Augustine had what he wanted, but it wasn't enough. Guilt dogged his steps. He sought truth, and although he had mastered the great philosophers and the demanding art of rhetoric, there remained a hole in his life. He was a man who didn't like to be controlled, something he certainly proved in his teen years, but he was honest enough to acknowledge that he was a captive, not to a person, but to his own lusts and passions. He was a man at war with himself. This idea of the good waging war with the bad drew him to a doctrinally twisted offshoot of Christianity. Oh my gosh, I know this word and I can't get it. It's Manichaeism. No. Manichaeism. I don't think I'm saying that right. I know it's, well, no, I'm going to listen. Founded by a man named Mani, this belief system saw everything as distinctly black and white, light and dark. This resonated with Augustine. He longed for the light, but sensed his soul was in the dark. Augustine began raising questions about certain aspects of Manichaeism, and his fellow followers told him to wait for Faustus of Malive, modern-day Algeria, who was the current leader of the movement. He did, but he was disappointed in the man's answers. Phosphorus and Manichaeism didn't measure up to Augustine's intellectual expectations and ultimately failed to answer the deep yearnings within him for truth. Augustine would eventually write a treatise against Manichaeism, exposing it for the faulty religion that it was. Manichaeism had failed to help, and philosophy, as much as Augustine loved it, didn't satisfy his deep hunger. So he continued his search. He traveled to Rome to teach and eventually found his way to Milan. There he met a man of powerful reputation, Ambrose. Ambrose was renowned for being an excellent speaker, and as a lifelong student of rhetoric, Augustine wanted to see if the man was everything he was reputed to be. He was. In Ambrose, Augustine found a man in whom Christianity and supreme intelligence lived in peace. Ambrose proved that Christianity was not only compatible with intelligence and learning, but complemented them. However, Augustine was not a quick convert. He still had powerful passions that drove him. In his book Confessions, he admits to a youthful prayer, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet." There was also another influence in his life, Christian monks. The monks had given up all their worldly possessions and surrendered normal life with wives and family for the monastery, or in some cases for living in isolation in desolate places like the desert. How could monks, many uneducated in Augustine's view, show so much discipline and self-control when he was a puppet of his own desires? A child's voice. In 386, Augustine was in another wrestling match with himself. He paced the garden outside his home, grappling with a nagging spiritual need. Internal struggles can be as vicious as physical ones. Augustine knew this. He was not a man just walking the garden and thinking things through. He was deep in an emotional and spiritual quagmire. As he fought through the despair and the agony, he heard a child's voice. "Take up and read. Take up and read." It was song-like. He assumed it came from the neighbors, but he was unable to tell if it was the voice of a young boy or girl. Regardless of the source, Augustine saw it as a direct message from God. Nearby was a copy of Paul's epistle to the Romans. He opened it and his eyes fell on two verses, Romans 13, chapter 13, verse 13 through 14. "Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts." The world receded from him, and Augustine could only focus on Paul's words. These words at this moment struck him as if they were written just for him. The instant I reached the end of the sentence, it seemed the light of peace was poured into my heart, and all shades of doubt faded away. The interplay of the garden setting, Augustine's inner turmoil and regrets for a misspent life, the sing-song voice of the child chanting a simple line and immediate access to just the right words at just the right time brought forth an immediate and permanent change in Augustine. He was, at that moment, made new in right relationship with Christ, a Christian. Loss. Augustine's mother, Monica, had recently joined him in Milan. It was a different person who walked back into the house and told he was a different person. No, it was a different person who walked back into the house and told his mother about what had just happened. For Monica, the years of ceaseless prayers made on behalf of her son were answered. Augustine then withdrew from Milan to a villa of Cassisiacum with his mother, son, some students, and a few others, and stayed there for about 7 months. It was in this villa that he prepared himself for his new Christian life. On Easter, Bishop Ambrose, the man who proved to Augustine that a Christian could be an intellectual, baptized Augustine and his son Adeodatus. In 387, Monica fell ill with a fever and died in Augustine's presence. She was 56 and he 33. His record of her passing is heartrending. I closed her eyelids, and sorrow beyond measure filled my heart and would have overflowed in tears, but by a strong effort of will I had no tears. It was not fitting that her funeral should be conducted with moaning and weeping, for such is normal when death is seen as only misery or as the complete end of existence. But she had not died in misery, and death was not her end. Of the one fact we were certain by reason of her character, of the other by our faith. After her death, Augustine and his son returned to Rome for a time. This was followed by travels to previous homes in Carthage and Tagaste. It was on one of his many trips that Augustine's personal world would be upended again. His son, just 17, the same age Augustine was when Adeodatus was born, died of unknown causes. Despite the tragic loss of his mother and son so close together, and despite dealing with his own debilitating illness, Augustine remained faithful. Pressed into the priesthood, he returned to North Africa and adopted a monastic life. In the city of Hippo, he attended services led by Bishop Valerius. On one such visit, the bishop preached a message laying out the church's need for priests. Augustine had no plan to be part of the clergy, but the congregation had a different idea. They insisted he be ordained. The thought of this brought Augustine to tears. Still, he had no desire to be a priest. Yet at age 43, and despite his initial resistance, Augustine found himself at the threshold of what would become 33 years of service as a priest of the church. Soon after, now that's been said more than one time. He had no desire, and yet they raked him in, it sounds to me. He had tears. It brought him to tears. Augustine found him at the threshold of what would become 33 years of service. How'd that happen, church? Soon after his ordination, at the request of Valerius, Augustine became the assistant bishop. When Valerius died, Augustine became the bishop of Hippo. Augustine threw himself into the work, writing unceasingly and preaching as often as twice a day, 5 days a week. Augustine was tremendously influential in his years of service. He stood with one foot in the classical world of philosophy and the other in the changing world of the church. As a teacher, he had debated heresies, but as a bishop, he had to confront them. Much of his writing focused on defending right doctrine and challenging the teaching of several cult groups and unorthodox sects. His battle was with the Manichaeans, the group he had once been a part of. Manichaeans were similar to the Gnostics, dividing the world into light and dark, spiritual and physical. This sect taught that Jesus had no physical body because physical was bad, and therefore did not die on the cross. To them, God was neither omnipotent nor fully creator. These ideas contradict the Bible. Augustine also took a stand against Donatists, who saw the church as filled with flawed priests and felt there should be a separate, pure church. The movement began almost a century before, when Emperor Diocletian persecuted the church and demanded, among other things, the burning of the scriptures. Christians could avoid persecution by turning in Bibles. Some did, including some church leaders. After the persecution ended, some returned to their positions in the church, infuriating those who had suffered and lost loved ones to the persecution. Sound familiar? It raised a theological problem. Could such flawed church leaders administer the sacraments? Augustine argued against the idea of a separate pure church. He wasn't opposed to pursuing purity, but because perfection was not possible, he could not align with the notion of a pure church. Most importantly, he argued that God's blessing was not dependent on priest purity, but on God's faithfulness. There would always be a mix of faithful and flawed priests. He drew on Jesus's parable of the wheat and tares. Oh, just said it this morning. A tare is a plant that looks very much like wheat until it matures. In Jesus' day, it was impossible to remove the tares without uprooting the wheat. The separation occurred only after the harvest. Augustine's point was simple. God will do the judging, not the natists. Damn it, get out of there, stupid bug. Stay out of my juice. Very interesting, since I was just talking about the wheat and separating the wheat from the chaff this morning in Bookless classroom. Really, like a long time on it. And Satan as well. And maybe that's his job. Augustine argued that original sin was passed. Additional important doctrine was defined when Augustine faced off with Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk who came to North Africa via Rome. Augustine took issue with Pelagius' belief that sin was not transmitted from Adam to all men and women. Pelagius believed that everyone sinned, but purely by choice. He denied a connection between sin and humankind's condition. He taught, and some still do, that a person could live a sinless life without the grace of God. Augustine argued that original sin was passed from Adam to everyone. Man needed the help of God to come to his salvation. He felt that this was what happened to him in the garden in Milan, and no one came to faith unless God called him. The Catholic Church would later declare Pelagius' teaching as heresy at the Council of Carthage, and it was denounced. For those of you really wanting to know what heresy probably is, those aren't bad counsels. To then revert to consequences of life and death, I don't know. Augustine's pen. Augustine faced much more than doctrinal turmoil. In 410, Alaric and his German Visigoths led forces against Rome. Overwhelmed city officials asked for terms of surrender. Alaric wasn't shy. All your gold, all your silver, all your German slaves. He and his men plundered the city, but then because he considered himself a Christian, belonging to a sect called Arianism, Alaric returned all valuables taken from churches. He died shortly after Rome fell. His army, however, continued to North Africa. The Visigoths would later take Augustine's beloved Hippo. Many had fled Rome, traveling to North Africa and to Hippo. Augustine ministered to these displaced people the best he could. The most difficult task was answering a question they all asked. The pagan residents of Rome believed that the ancient gods were punishing them for allowing Christian emperors to rule and the church to thrive. It was more than an idle thought. Some called for a return to the gods who were worshipped when Rome was great. Augustine decided to answer this prevailing and culturally relevant question, spending 16 years in writing an answer in the form of the classic book, City of God. He wanted Christians to understand that they now lived in the city of the world, but would eternally live in the city of God. It was a tale of two cities, the one that awaits and the temporary one in which we all live. That's so interesting. I've got to highlight that. So that is an interesting I mean, you can certainly see with the upheaval of Christianity, where Romans would believe that a return in the belief of their gods, where they did see superiority, might be the answer. Monotheism. The book is one of the most beloved of all ancient literature and remains a reminder that this life is not the end of the story, but only the beginning. He encouraged Christians not to dwell on what is, but on the city that is to come. Augustine couldn't stop the Visigoths, but he could focus on Christian minds on something greater than what they were losing. Now, I could see where that is well, I can only say it this way, diabolically misleading if he didn't have the right heart for that, if his heart was political. You know what I'm saying? Do you? Augustine penned other works, over 100 books, 500 sermons, and 200 letters. Like many of the great church leaders, he changed the world of his time and the world to come through his writing. Perhaps his best-known book is Confessions, which tells his life story and conversion. He wrote it as if penning a letter to God. If Confessions is his autobiography, then retractions, can be called his intellectual autobiography. In Revisions, he reviews and corrects his earlier writings. He also wrote books on doctrine, philosophy, biblical interpretation, and the history of heresies. Augustine filled the world of his day with his intellect, his presence, and his written words still read today. Protestants are fond of Augustine because he emphasized the grace of God. Catholics love his support of the church and the sacraments. Some of his teachings would later be abused, but that was through no fault of his own. His life story is also an inspiration. His rebellious days, the constant search for truth, his misdeeds and his admission of them, his inner turmoil and his struggles with his desires speaks to many believers today, people who struggle with many of the same sins and compulsions. He was a fractured man made whole by Christ. He did not seek power, but when it was thrust upon him, he was dedicated and passionate in fulfilling his duties. Excelente. Let's read about Pope. I think I have a couple books on him that my sister, the devout Catholic, gave me. Pope Leo I, the Pope who roared. Circa 400 to 461. One is ashamed to say this, and yet one dares not be silent. You value the devils higher than the apostles. Pope Leo I, Sermon to the Romans, 455. The Cullinan diamond is considered the largest gem quality diamond ever discovered. It weighs in at over 3,100 carats, over 600 grams. Several large diamonds were cut from the stone. Only after being cut by diamond experts could the Cullinan diamond begin to shine. This can be a fitting metaphor for the church. The contemporary church is like a cut diamond. Each cut diamond is unique. It shares some common characteristics of the original it came from, but also has distinctions that set it apart. The problem with the church has been that in the process of such cutting, creating, and refining, there have been instances where shattering has occurred. A man at the center of one of these diamond cuttings was Leo, the Bishop of Rome. We know nothing of his early life. He just appears on history's stage. It is assumed that he had a noble birth in Tuscany. Yeah, I would assume you might assume that. Since you made him Pope Leo, what else would you do? Wow, nothing? Nothing at all? Sounds like an orphan who was born into poverty. Let's start right there. Any records on the people in poverty at the beginning of the church time? Let's start there. He just appears on his... Okay. Beyond that, his early life is lost to us. Beyond the assumption, his later work, it's still lost. Let me clue you in. That's an assumption. You're still lost. However, is much better known. He would prove he was a talented man, able to preach mind-grabbing sermons, influence emperors, face down invading kings, prosecute heresy, and make theological arguments for his belief. Emperor Valentian III sent Leo to Gaul to mediate a dispute. While there, Sixtus III died, and Leo, although absent from Rome at the time, was elected to replace the bishop, and replace him he did. Early in the church's history, wasn't Sixtus... I just read that name. Like a Roman god? Because that's what I've been reading about. At times, they would gather to debate and refine a questionable bit of doctrine. Some bishops rose to prominence based on their scholarship, preaching, or administration. Yet there remained a conviction that all bishops stood on an equal footing. Uh-oh. Some, however, refer to the Bishop of Rome as the first among equals. Leo wasn't comfortable with that. To Leo, the Bishop of Rome held a higher position than anyone else, and all other bishops should follow the leadership of the Roman Church. You arrogant bastard, you. Saving Rome. In 452, Attila the Hun had brought havoc to the Roman Empire and now threatened the city of Rome. That's always interesting as well. Because there's always this questionable area in earlier history. And I think Attila has something to do with it. But this is 452, so, you know. But Attila got an army going on here. A delegation from the city went to meet him, not a delegation of politicians or rulers or military leaders, but of priests, including Leo, the Bishop of Rome. Bruce Shelley described it this way: man to man, the contest seemed unequal. On the one side, the law of conquest, on the other, the law of faith. On the one side, triumph over the wounded, the ravaged, the dying. On the other, submission to the divine mysteries of the church. A foreign king and a ruling pope. Behind Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, stood countless soldiers I mean, why the scourge of God? I mean, I get it, but what I'm saying is why are you proud of that, Attila? Behind Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, stood countless soldiers. Next to Leo, a couple of priests. It was Daniel in the lion's den. Attila had left many dead in his wake. He was a man to be feared, while he could appear humble before invited guests. He had no qualms about putting people in their graves. A man of short stature, a broad chest, a large head, a thin graying beard, small eyebrows, and a flat nose. He may not have looked fierce, but any soldier who faced him knew otherwise. Had Leo come with an offer of surrender, there may have been less danger, but his mission was not that easy, nor his message that welcome. Leo faced the feared conqueror and made a simple request: go away. He spoke not as a military man, but as a bishop of Rome, a spiritual man. Attila's army had suffered from an onset of disease and a lack of food. But some historians believe the Hun was already thinking about leaving the city alone. Even so, Leo faced the man Roman soldiers feared and prevailed. Attila not only retreated from Rome, he left Italy entirely. This remarkable act of bravery and conviction raised Leo's standing with the people and with secular leaders. 3 years later, he would have to do it again. That is astounding. That is astounding. And you can understand then why this idea, I don't think of infallibility, but certainly of godly qualities. Or, no, that God is working through you. But God is working through all of us. He needs a man like Leo the lion, right, who roars for people to see. I don't know. What did they say his stature was? Because none of the statures is anything like Solomon's, right? I have to highlight. That's what I'm doing here, is highlighting. Go away. He spoke as the Bishop of Rome, a spiritual man with conviction. Go away. You know who we are. You know we are godly people. Go away. Love it. So 3 years later, he would do it again, saving Rome a second time. The glory days of Rome were long gone. Once it had ruled the world with shield and sword, but now it struggled to keep what little dignity it had. Outside forces like Attila plagued the empire and its glorious city. Rome would endure a series of attacks over the centuries in 410, 455, 546, 846, 1084, and 1527. In Leo's day, the Roman military was a shadow of its previous self. Once no force could stand before them, now they seemed unable to stand by themselves. The Vandals, an East Germanic tribe, approached Rome in May 455 to continue their practice of looting, pillaging, and murdering citizens. Nice Germanic tribes we have going on there. What was the other one? Called Arianism. This really is astounding. And actually, to me, is evidence for this whole repeating of history. For sure. It just seems like that's the effing studying of the data we should be doing. Stop with your fucking economists and stop with your fucking pharmaceuticals. You fucking MD jackasses. Jesus Christ. Oh, there we are. The Vandals. I'm sorry, did you say the Van Andals? I wouldn't doubt that they certainly are willing to say, we are that Germanic tribe. Ask them. You mean the tribe of, with the practice of looting, pillaging, and murdering citizens? You mean that tribe? The Vandal king, Genseric, agreed to meet with Leo. Generic? What was that? You own the brand of Generic? Which Amway did. Check out the Van Andals. Here's a little bit more modern history, but still history. Check it out. Once again, the bishop, check it out, had taken it upon himself to intercede on behalf of his city and people. Genseric and Leo were the same age, 65. The Vandal leader moved with a limp, the result of a fall from a horse when he was young. Leo offered money and, perhaps sensing that he could not expect the king to give up the plunder, asked that the city and its citizens be spared. The Roman army could no longer be counted on. Even the emperor had been killed by one of his bodyguards and dragged into the streets, where he was torn to pieces. Leo's goal was to save the citizens and buildings. Genseric nodded, then made a single statement: 14 days of looting. He kept his word. The city was stripped of its wealth, although most of the churches were spared from plundering. Genseric also took senators and Empress Licinia, Eudoxia, and her daughters for ransom. He even took the gilded roof off the capital. When his ships were loaded, the Vandals left. Rome stood still. Most of the citizenry survived, all because Leo once again put faith against power. A solemn Thanksgiving ceremony was held, but few attended. It would take some time for the fear to subside. At the service, Leo was direct and pointed. One is ashamed to say this, and yet one dares not be silent. You value the devils higher than the apostles. Who has restored security to the city? Who has liberated, preserving it from massacre? Turn to the Lord. Acknowledge the miracles he has manifestly wrought on our behalf, and describe our liberation not, as the goddesses do, to the influence of the stars, but to the ineffable mercy of the Almighty, who has softened the rage of the barbarians. Once again, the people knew who had interceded on their behalf: Peter and Leo. Leo had strong opinions about how ecclesiastical authority should trickle down to the churches. Trickle down economics. While many claimed the Bishop of Rome held a special authority, Leo clearly came from nowhere and set this whole scene up. Maybe he came from Hun. 13 days of pillaging everything. We're going to take your effing roof. Just saying. Thanks for the trickle down economic lesson. While many claim the Bishop of Rome held special authorities, Leo clearly stated the scriptural mandates justifying the church's authority. Number one, Peter, when asked about who he believed Jesus to be, proclaimed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, and received Jesus' blessing for his bold and accurate statement. Now, and what is blessing? What, it was more than a blessing. He said you couldn't have known that. So this is showing, he says that came from God, but it came from God. Didn't make Peter any more upstanding, even though that was the argument with Peter, James, and John, than the others, right? Jesus said he would build his church upon that statement and upon Peter, to whom he gave the keys to heaven and hell. Jesus prayed for Peter, Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. That is so beautiful, isn't it? Peter is seen as the chief of the apostles. Number 4, Peter is seen as the chief of the apostles. Number 5, it was to Peter that Jesus said, feed my sheep. Number 6, it was by God's direction that Peter ministered and died in Rome and that his body was buried there. According to Leo, authority was transferred from Peter to the Bishop of Rome. All authority rested with the church and the Pope. Pope comes from the Greek and Latin for papa. Was to lead the church. Whoever was not a part of the church in Rome was outside of the faith. To challenge the Pope's authority was to court hell. Obedience to the Pope was necessary for salvation. Now, those are some mighty perversions of God's word. To challenge the Pope's authority was to court hell. Obedience to the Pope was necessary for salvation, according to Leo. He was successful in furthering this belief, but not everyone was so agreeable. In the end, the diamond fractured, with the head of the Eastern Church in Constantinople seeing his power as equal to that of Leo's. Over time, there would be other factions that remain to this day. In the centuries ahead, the papacy would grow in power and the Roman Church would expand around the world. It would do much good, but also be plagued by troubles from within. Groups would continue to split, and new denominations would be born. Leo shaped the church through his dedication to a pure doctrine, defending it from heresy, and by showing courage and strength born of faith when he faced Attila the Hun and later the Vandal king of Genseric. His leadership and determination strengthened the authority posture of the Western Church, which, by the way, is economic. Ultimately, the idea of the supremacy of the Roman bishop would drive a wedge between East and West, but Leo's force of will and his stated beliefs, which is definitely what we need in any church, a force of human will. First thing in addiction to power. You are powerless. And his stated beliefs have moved Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox churches, and Anglicans to venerate him through the ages. The Venerable Bede, changing the world with his pen circa 673 to 735. I really don't work night and day, but it is quite true that I do toil hard to reach a right judgment on all that I read. Bede, in response to a letter from Ecca of Hexham. There is a scene in the movie Amadeus that is difficult to forget. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is propped up in bed dying. He is only 35. Around the candles cast a golden glow and flicker as if mimicking the fading life of the musician. Longtime nemesis Antonio Salieri has decided to help Mozart with the last parts of his Requiem. He jots down what Mozart says, barely able to keep up with the maestro's machine gun delivery. Soon after, Mozart dies with the work unfinished. Long before the great composer lived, another man would be faced with a similar situation. He was a British monk named Bede, a man of unique ability, gentle disposition, and relentless drive. Bede was to scholarly research and history what Mozart was to music. He was a master. Born in northern England, 7 years old, Bede found himself in the care of monks, perhaps as an orphan. He lived, wouldn't Pope Leo somehow, if he were born into wealth, have a great history? Everyone would have known him when he was born, everything about him? Yeah, suspicion. So Bede, 7 years old. We know about him. He lived with monks of Wearmouth Abbey, eventually moving with them to a new monastery a short distance away. He seldom left the grounds, and the few times he did, it was to visit nearby friends. Bede would live the rest of his life behind the walls of that abbey. His first teacher was the abbot or head of the abbeys, Benedict Biscop. Biscop was a nobleman who gave up everything to become a monk at the age of 25. One thing he didn't surrender was his love of books. He often returned from his trips with new tomes, and Bede wasted no time learning from them. Bede loved to study scripture and learn Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. He was not just a scholar with a particular interest in history, but he was also a man of faith. Of the 40 books Bede wrote, 32 of them deal with biblical matters. Considering this is somewhat odd that he is best remembered for his historical accounts. Would be interesting texts to talk about, and probably would be, from a Catholic perspective, deemed heresy, but great texts to try and interest people in such a wonderful debate as we have. Bede was ordained as a deacon at the age of 19. Usually a man could not be ordained to that office until he had reached 25. This was rare and is a testimony to the high regard he had earned. At the age of 30, Bede was ordained as a priest. Each day he would carry out his duties as a monk, prayer worship, teaching, and in his case, study. He was so dedicated to his work that he turned down the opportunity to become abbot because its demands would take him away from what he considered his true calling. Let me guess, he was roped in? It has ever been my delight to learn or teach or write. For some, deep study is boring and difficult. For Bede, it was the purpose of his life. If the libraries of the day used the Dewey Decimal System, then Bede's books would be in at least 7 categories. He wrote educational works for his students, expository works on the scriptures, letters, sermons, poetry, biographies of the saints, and history. It was his work in the last category that had the greatest impact on the world and Christian community. The ecclesiastical history of England covers the span between 55 BC and 73 AD. Bede also made use of BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. Love it. I stopped using before current era and after current era, which I got from JW Watchtower. Prior to this, there has been no formal unified history of Britain. By creating this work, he recorded many stories and accounts that would have otherwise been lost. He researched and interviewed and did so with the goal of finding the facts. He wanted real accounts, not fabricated stories. The heroes were not warriors, as was common in the oral histories of the day, but people of great faith. He consulted and cited over 140 sources, much of what we know about the history of England during that time we know because of Bede's work. To his dying breath, in 735, Bede grew ill. He sensed that his days were numbered. He had been working on a translation of the Gospel of John, translating it from Latin to English. As he felt his life slipping away, he pushed his pupil, Cuthbert, to write faster, fearing like Mozart did, that he would die before the work was completed. Some of his last words tell us much about the man. I have some little articles of value in my chest, such as pepper, napkins, and incense. Run quickly and bring the priests of our monastery to me, that I may distribute among them the gifts which God has bestowed on me. The rich in this world are bent on giving gold and silver and other precious things, but I, in charity, would joyfully give my brothers what God has given me. He also said, It is time that I return to him who formed me out of nothing. I have lived long. My merciful judge well foresaw my life for me. The time of my dissolution draws nigh, for I desire to die and be with Christ. Bede finished his work. Back in the monastic cell, he knelt at his bed and began to sing the Gloria Patri. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. His fellow monks found him dead on the floor of his room. Bede lived in an age not known for great scholarship, yet he undertook the monumental task of writing a history of the English Church, and did so in a time when gathering accurate information was difficult. This he did, and his other works as well, as a gift to God and the world. He raised the level of religious scholarship in his day, and he introduced a concept we use without question today, BC and AD. He, like a handful of others, believed that what had happened in the past mattered in the present. Much of what we knew about the early English church we know because a monk living behind the walls of an abbey. Okay, those were the 3 stories. Tomorrow we are going to read about Anselm, the reluctant archbishop. Oh, another one. From 1033 to 1109, I believe that I may understand. Anselm Proslogian 1. Jeez, tongue twisters. Francis of Assisi, Simple Faith, 1183 to 1226. I've done my duty, may Christ teach you yours. The last words of Francis of Assisi, recorded by his biographer, Bonaventure. Thomas Aquinas, the not-so-dumb ox, 1225 to 1274. Reginald, I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me. Thomas Aquinas, in response to Reginald of Paperno's urgent request, he returned to work. And then, chapter 21, John Wycliffe, the Protestant in Catholic clothing, circa 1320 to 1384. I am ready to defend my convictions even unto death. I have followed the sacred scriptures and the holy doctors. John Wycliffe, Protestatio. Those are the 3 for tomorrow. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thank you so much for joining me for chapters 15, 16, and 17. Is that right? Yes. I might have gone on with some more descriptions than I should have. 15, 16, and 17. We will be reading tomorrow chapters 18, 19, and 20 from our book, 60 People Who Have Shaped the Church. Not the Catholic Church, although they do have, Catholic Church is rooted in the head apostle Peter. So, Learning from Sinners, Saints, and Rogues by Alton Gansky. Thanks so much for joining me here for our first of 3 days back on day 261 in the classroom. It is October 21st. We are here in the classroom making you healthy, wealthy, and wiser by making sure that we take care of your mind, your body, and your spirit. Thanks for joining me.